I have the meditation of each and every one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our redeemer. Amen. So who liked the snow? Definitely not a majority. There are hands, but they're not a majority. I don't like snow. I'm just a big kid at heart anyway. One of the best times was, probably 20 years ago now when we were living up in Highland Lakes that we had that storm that stalled over the area for a couple of days, the nor'easter. We had in the middle of our front lawn, where it would have blown away from, it was 38 inches of snow. And we were literally snowed in for 3 days. We could not get out. They eventually used a bucket loader to clear the streets. I loved it. We went out in the tunnels in the snow and everything. We had food, so we were good. See, the key when something like that happens is to make sure that you have what you need, so that you don't find yourself without milk or food or whatever else, that you have oil in your fuel tank, so you have heat, those kind of things. When you looked at the stories about public officials talking about this snowstorm, Christie himself said the night of the snowstorm that we didn't expect it was going to be anywhere near this much snow. Now, the interesting thing is, the forecasters got it right, everybody else got it wrong. And the reason so many of us lost power is because a lot of trees came down. Yes, the leaves on the trees made that worse. But I remember when I was up at Stony Point, we had Rockland Electric up there, and every fall, usually in October, so it might not work this year, but every fall they would go around and they would cut off the branches that were overhanging the wires, so that if those branches came down, they wouldn't land on the wires and take the wires out. And we didn't lose power up there all that often. We had a lot of flickers before they put a substation in. Everybody knows about. But once they put a substation in, we were pretty good, and we really didn't lose power all that much, because the whole thing is being prepared. Now, Jesus tells a parable about being prepared. Paul, in writing to the Thessalonians, talks to them about being prepared. And Joshua talks to the Israelites about how they need to live, how they need to be prepared. Now that's an interesting passage in the Scriptures. It is at basically near the end of the book of Joshua. Now, if you remember the story, we had Moses and all that kind of stuff, and he brought them to the Promised Land. Joshua brought them in, and then you had all the battles, like Jericho. I promise I won't say anymore. But what happened was that the book of Joshua details the conquest of the land of Canaan. When the Israelites went through the area, and they beat the people who were there in wars, and they took over the land. Now this story, this speech Joshua is giving, is to the Israelites after the land had been secured. Now many Bible scholars feel that when the Israelites left to go into Egypt, there were some that remained. Maybe some cousins or some relatives of Israel or Jacob. And his 12 sons stayed there in the Promised Land. So when the people who had gone to Egypt, when Joseph was in charge over there, second in command, now had come back into the land, and the thought is that there were people there who were part of that group, and they were now being made party to the covenant, which is why the covenant is explaining exactly what it means. Joshua says, who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve God? Or are you going to serve those gods that your ancestors served beyond the river? Now you would think the Israelites who would come in and just conquer the land, saw God deliver these armies into their hands by various means. You can read about those in Joshua. Probably were not going around with idols and other gods. They had heard the stories about what happened to their parents when they refused to trust God and go to the Promised Land. They had to wander in the desert 40 years until they all died. They had seen what God had done in parting the river so they could come into the promised land. They had seen what God did through all these battles. More than likely, these folks were worshiping God. Now, the ones who had been in the land would have been living among other peoples. And it's reasonable to assume maybe they did have other gods. But either way, what Joshua says here, and this is over the doorpost of an awful lot of houses, including ours, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua said, listen, make a decision. Now, God is faithful. God brought us here like He said He would. God does what God says God's going to do. We can trust those promises, but God also says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. If you don't listen to God's commands, God will come down on your heart. But it's your decision. Make your decision. You're going to serve those gods from across the river, or you're going to serve God. Now, you and I look at that and say, well, these people were very, very primitive. You know, they had little statues and they thought of it as a god. And they would do sacrifices to it. You know, we don't do those kind of things. Anybody here have an altar set up in my house with a little statue there? No? Didn't think so. I would be kind of disturbed if people rose their hand. Maybe that's why they didn't raise their hands. But, you know, for those people, that's what constituted a God. Now, you hear me talk an awful lot about priority list. You know, what place does God occupy in your life? Is God the first thing? Or is God someplace down the list? The biblical idea of tithing is based upon God being the number one thing, with everything else falling in behind that. And so an idol, well, it can be a statue, can really be anything that gets above God in that priority list. And if you've got something in your life that is above God in your priority list, you are worshiping other gods. Because you have allowed that thing to take the place of God in your life. Oh, geez, I don't do that. But I can't do this thing that God wants me to do because I need to do this thing for my job, and my job comes first. Phrase I think most of us have heard at one time or another, right? You know, that's what your boss wants. Your earthly boss. A job can become an idol. It can become a god. Something else that can become a god. I'll do anything for my family. My family comes before anything else. It comes before my job. It comes before that. It comes before anything. Family can become a god. You can add to that list money, power, your possessions, prestige. See, there's an awful lot. We might not have little statues, but there are an awful lot of gods competing for that place that only belongs to the one true God. Paul says, listen, we need to live godly lives. If we don't live godly lives, that God who promises to love us and honor us and take care of us and be there for us, promises that if we follow God's commandments. And if we're not leading godly lives, we just release God from that promise, don't we?